Well, I'm very pleased to be back, and I have a ton of stuff here, so I'm going to zip through it pretty fast. Even though they've given me a whole hour, I realize they actually want time for questions, so there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. This builds on what I spoke on last year. Many of you were here last year. It doesn't actually repeat any of that, although some of the topics that I addressed last year, there's been further progress on them, so I'll update you on those. But, you know, fundamentally, everybody recognizes that we live in an interconnected world, and what that means is that the parties in an interconnected system become interdependent. And that's not a bad thing, because it means, in our context, for example, when we're developing new standards, building new technologies, we don't have to start from scratch. And the goal, obviously, is interoperability. So this, I think, is the kind of value chain that we're looking for here, that the fact of interconnectedness means that there's enhanced interdependence throughout the system, which really mandates interoperability. And what that does is it leads parties that were previously independent in silos to start collaborating and to start converging these standards. And that's really what we're seeing happening these days. It's really quite exciting. I will point out, since I'm talking to I talk to lots of different kinds of publishing audiences, I'm talking to an STM publishing audience, and let's be honest, the STM ecosystem is actually more interoperable than any other sector of publishing already. And why is that? Well, we all basically use the same, I mean, yes, Wiley uses Wiley ML, et cetera, but everybody uses JETs and now BITS, XML. It's fundamental to the ecosystem. We use DOIs as identifiers. We've got Crossref. We use journal hosting platforms. Content is distributed by subscription or by open access. An important thing is that the consumers of our content are the same people that are the creators of our content. The authors are the researchers that are the readers. And all those things you all take for granted, but those are actually quite unique to the scholarly publishing ecosystem, and they're really not the case in other publishing sectors. So on the one hand, you know, when talking to this audience, one of my goals is to help you be aware of things that are happening in other sectors that can be useful to this sector. But I can assure you that I give a lot of talks to people in other sectors and say, you need to be aware of what's done in scholarly publishing. I'll give you just an off-the-cuff example. I do some work with a standards group in the magazine industry, and I was talking to the person that leads that effort, and she was saying, you know, Bill, what we really need is we need an article identifier. And I'm saying, you know, journals have an article identifier, have had for years and years and years. They've got systems built around this. It's a permanent, stable identifier. You need to know about this. So we convened a little meeting in New York a few weeks ago, brought in a magazine aggregator, person from Time Inc., person from Meredith, person from the ad industry, et cetera. And I had Chuck Kosher from Crossref come. And as we were kind of going around the table, introducing ourselves and saying who does what, the guy from the magazine aggregator is one of the biggest magazine aggregators, right? So they do tons and tons of magazines. They're basically like the high wire of the magazine industry, or the Patapon of the magazine industry. There are a handful of these big aggregators, just as there are in STM. And I asked him, well, what kinds of magazines do you handle? And he said, oh, all kinds. A lot of consumer magazines, a lot of business-to-business magazines, medical, journal content, and medical literature, et cetera. Lots and lots of stuff is in our platform. And he's going on and on about how there are no identifiers. They wish there was an identifier for these things. They wish there was some kind of consistent metadata, but it's all over the map. It's just a mess. And I said, well, I guarantee you that the medical content that you're handling, every one of those articles has a DOI. Not only that, it has a Crossref DOI, and it has consistent metadata associated with every one of those articles. And he was just, you're kidding me. You've got to be kidding me. All of this content that I'm already dealing with already has that, and I didn't even know it. That's just an example of people in what would appear to be a closely related sector of publishing don't even know about the DOI, don't even know about Crossref. So anyway, What I'm trying to do is help foster this kind of inter-sector communication. So why does this work so well in our sector? Well, first of all, there's a lot of collaboration between publishers, and my footnote, including vendors and libraries and aggregators, et cetera. But really, how was Crossref created in the first place? It was a lot of the major publishers getting together and thinking, who are, by the way, fierce competitors of each other, saying, we have to get together and solve this problem because we have to have a citation linking technology that allows bidirectional linking between publishers' platforms. And that's how Crossref was created. And why is that? It's because citation and access is actually essential to research. That's what we're all about. So that really is what drove this sector to get so far ahead of most other publishing sectors that really don't have that kind of need in their systems. An interesting analogy or an interesting counterpart is something that's happening in the entertainment industry. There's an ID registry called IDER, which is a DOI-based registry for entertainment content. It's movies, TV shows, et cetera. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily relevant to what we're doing, but it's interesting that years later, the entertainment industry is really developing a technology and a platform that's really very similar to what we've got in our industry. Very Crossref-like kind of infrastructure and set of services around it. So talking to this group, we might think, well, then what's the problem? Right? We're ahead of the game. We're all set. Well, as long as we stay in this nice, comfortable STM silo, we're pretty well all set. But the point is that there's a bigger world out there, and there's a lot happening in that other parts of the publishing ecosystem that could benefit us, and we could benefit it. And ultimately, this all needs to work together and much better. And so why this convergence is happening, it's the result of multi-dimensional collaboration. Collaboration between sectors, collaboration globally, geographically, building standards by incorporating other standards as you build the new standard rather than reinventing those wheels. And so anyway, let me give you a few examples. I'm going to start with a pretty extensive part of my talk on rights, just because it illustrates a lot of the points that I'm trying to make. And then I'm going to give you a bunch of other updates after we get done with this. So my whole talk isn't about rights, but a lot of it will seem like that for a while. And the whole idea here is the need to make rights expressions interoperable. So I'm going to give you two contrasting examples. One is a journal that's probably very familiar to a lot of you, and one is a college textbook. So let's look at PNAS, which is a hybrid journal. And so one of the problems that a hybrid journal has had is this article open access or not, right? Got to have a way to determine that. And so, boom, I had nothing to do with it, our sector created ALI, access and license indicators. In fact, when I was doing this presentation, I very carefully had my last year's presentation open because I think I already told them about ALI. Well, no, it wasn't, because it was January this year, after my last year's talk, that this actually happened. So I did not actually mention this last year. It seems like it's been almost a year. And I use this as an example in lots of these talks because this is such a simple, elegant solution. Really involved only two XML elements. One is free to read, which is this article free to read, yes or no? And it optionally has a way to express a start date, like an embargo, and an end date for when it's free to read. And then another element, license ref, which points to a stable URI where you can find the license terms, which is on your platform, Creative Commons license, wherever it is, that URI points you to that. So this was virtually, by the way these kinds of things go, virtually instantly incorporated into JATS XML. So it's now in the JATS 1.1, which is just about like any day now, actually official. It's finished, it's just not officially official. Crossref already had license ref, and so they added the free to read element in their API almost immediately. So not only did the standard or the recommended practice get created, but it got implemented in our ecosystem pretty much right away. So why was that so easy to do, and why did it happen so quickly? Well, first of all, it's because it was a collaboration within the scholarly publishing sector. So if you look at the members of the working group, this is the NISO working group that created that. It was Crossref, PLOS, Spark, Editor, STM, ACS, a couple of university libraries, Social Science Research Network, Wellcome, Copyright Clearance Center, Creative Commons, Europeana, JISC, Elsevier. So to you guys, you would look at that and say, well, that's a nice, diverse working group, right? Well, within our sector, it's a nice, diverse working group, but looking from the outside, it's all within the STM sector. So they all knew what the problem was, knew how to address it, and could get the problem fixed very quickly. It's a real luxury that we have. Very homogeneous ecosystem. The fact that journal access is already online and that it's article-based. This is something that, frankly, the magazine industry is just grasping, that they need to be delivering articles, not issues of magazine. Hello, this is kind of obvious quite a while ago, but most of their systems are still based on delivering issues only of magazines, which makes no sense. There are already established support systems. The hosting platforms that we use don't exist in most other sectors. They do in magazines, but not in most others. Books, for example, et cetera. We have Crossref, we've got academic libraries. This is really a very homogeneous system. And the fact that this particular problem and this solution was only concerned with the article, it wasn't concerned with any components of the article. It just is the article as a whole, either free to read or not. And it was easy to incorporate in the JATS metadata header. And also notably, the metadata in our sector travels with the asset. The metadata is right in the article in a JATS XML file. That also is uncharacteristic of most other sectors. The book industry, for example, they have tons of metadata. It's Onyx metadata, but it's sent out from their marketing departments in a monthly or weekly feed that's totally separate from the products themselves. The products don't have any metadata. It's the separate feed is where the metadata is. In our case, the metadata just travels with the thing. That's a big plus. So that was the easy solution. Now let's look at the harder problem, which is this college textbook. So just imagine that even one chapter in a book like this could have a video from Condé Nast, an interview from the BBC, a photo license from Getty, an article from PNAS, commissioned an illustration from an artist, got some text from a trade book. The educator created some content, student created some content. And by the way, I should point out that harking back to this morning, it was like really interesting for me to really see the emphasis on platform this morning, because that's exactly what's happening now, certainly in the higher ed educational space, is those publishers don't think book, they think platform. So the textbook is no longer the thing that they're focusing on, it's the platform. The textbook is one part of that. So all this stuff is in the platform that book lives in. In that case, that's a Cambridge one, and their platform is called Elevate. Well, here's the thing. What rights did they obtain for all those assets? This video, this interview, this photo, that article, this illustration, that chunk of text, et cetera. What rights did they obtain? What formats are those assets provided in? What metadata came along with them? Do any of those assets have embedded assets? An article probably has an image in it, et cetera. And so those embedded assets have embedded rights. So this is really not a simple problem, because those assets are all coming from different sectors. The BBC's from the news sector. The Condé Nast thing is from the magazine sector. The PNAS article is from the scholarly sector, et cetera, et cetera. The file formats are all different. They don't just plug in. The sectors don't use the same rights metadata, and hardly any of it is machine resolvable. Metadata isn't usually in the asset, and a big textbook platform like that has hundreds and hundreds of these embedded assets. So this is really a huge problem for these people. It's true of magazines, it's true of big textbooks. So this really is why we really have to have multi-sector collaboration. So I'm going to look at just rights activity specifically. This is just one segment of the work that's going on in the industry, but I'm just going to look at some rights activity in some of these various standards groups from various sectors. So first of all, BISG is the Book Industry Study Group. That's the US counterpart to BIC here in the UK. So it's the mainly trade book. It's all kinds of books, and it's the entire supply chain, but I will say it's dominated by the big trade publishers and the supply chain that they use, the retailers, et cetera. When BISG is focusing on rights, and they're actively doing this, again, this is something that they actively did a while ago. I'll get back to that in a minute. But it's now a newly urgent issue for them. But the focus is on authors and agents, and it's really all about tracking royalties. And it has to do with agents, which, you know, in our world, that's not an issue, right? But to them, these agencies that have, you know, the authors now have, their books are distributed as ebooks, and they're all in these different platforms, and the platforms have completely inconsistent requirements, completely inconsistent vocabularies. It's just an absolute nightmare for these people to deal with this. So that's mainly what they're focusing on. So what have they done? They've got a fantastic, rich, expressive, controlled vocabulary about rights that nobody uses. This is really a useful thing. So, and I've got, by the way, almost everything, all the things like that I mentioned in this talk, my last 2 slides are a list of all the URLs to all these things. So you'll be able to get the presentation and you'll be able to find that. So, you know, just take a look at that control vocabulary from BISG, and it's really a useful thing. So even if you need such a thing and it's not exactly what they created, you don't have to start from scratch because they've got a heck of a good starting point for you there. But, and it's designed for machine and human interoperability, and notice that I underscored the word designed. I'll get back to why that's important. Corollary to that, they also have a payment spec. Very complex, detailed model. It's aligned with that control vocabulary. It's actually based on the Copyright Clearance Center payment spec. Why is it so complex? Well, the publishers insisted on it being complex. They started out wanting it to be simple, right? But then the publishers that were involved in the working group said, well, wait a minute, we needed to be able to express this, and we need to be able to handle this eventuality and that eventuality, et cetera. And so it got complicated. One of the things, my friends in the metadata, and particularly in the rights world, is Mark Bide. One of his, I quote him all the time saying, the standard is only complicated because what it's trying to express is complicated. It's inherently complicated. I don't want it to be complicated. It just already is complicated. Editeur is an international, the BISG is a US organization. Editeur is an international organization. They publish a number of important standards. The most prominent one that they're really famous for is ONIX, which is this book supply chain metadata used almost universally around the world now in the book supply chain. The BISG controlled vocabulary is based on ONIX. In other words, every time there's an expression of something that ONIX already has the controlled vocabulary for, they use the ONIX term, because all of those people already use ONIX. There's also one for journals that isn't as well known, ONIX PL for publication licenses, and there's also one for rights services called ONIX RS that comes out of Editeur. So here's the thing, though. Books and journals, for now, have been able to live with a situation where we can have to look up and read the licensing terms, right? The news industry and the magazines can't live with that. We've got, you know, basically, why that works for us is that a library needs to know that everything they get from PNAS has such and such license terms in it, and they can look at ALI and get the terms, et cetera. And the systems in the library and the systems in the hosting platform can be engineered to do this. They don't have to be necessarily reading the contract for every darn asset that they encounter that has rights associated with it, right? It's across the board. Whereas in these two industries, it's an incredibly granular thing. And here's an example from the news industry. The Associated Press produces, you're all sitting down, 250,000 assets every day. 250,000 assets per day. 150,000 are textual assets and 100,000 are image assets every day, all year long. That cannot tolerate a system where somebody has to find a contract and read what it says to see if they have rights to one of those assets, right? They have to have interoperable, machine-readable rights. Well, they do. They've developed, it's not just the AP is part of an organization called IPTC, which is the International Press Telecommunications Council. They and many others work together to develop this ODRL, which is the Open Digital Rights Language, and this is a framework for expressing rights metadata in a machine-readable way, and it expresses things like policy types and actions that are permitted or prohibited, constraints, can only do this time or this many times or in this way, parties and roles, relations, etc. So this is an XML framework for expressing all these things about rights. Very, very useful. Well, here's my skeptical guy that I pretty much have in every presentation I give, saying, wait a minute, is that a real web standard? Because actually, not quite, because it was done by what's called a community group in the W3C. I won't get into the Byzantine architecture of the W3C, which is just crazy, but, and it's all acronym driven. But a CG, which is a community group, really anybody can join a community group and they can come up with whatever they come up with, but it's not an official web standard. A working group is actually on what's called a rec track. I was giving this a little summary to the editorial annual meeting at the Frankfurt Book Fair a few months ago, and was just updating people on what's happening, because the news is ODRL now is on a rec track at the W3C, which means it's now, well, it's about to be put on a rec track. The wheels are in motion. And one of the people at the editorial annual meeting, after I finished talking and was, giving some examples, et cetera, she said, "Oh, I thought you meant rec like W-R-E-C-K track." No, that means recommendation. It's on track to become an official W3C recommendation. So it is now, and what it's now called, as of 2 weeks ago, it was called something else prior to that. 2 weeks ago, it was officially renamed Open Permissions and Obligation Expression. So that's what the successor official W3C standard to ODRL is going to be. To the people at the AP and IPTC are somewhat panicked about this because, and the other people, the New York Times uses ODRL, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of big users already. And what they don't want, frankly, is for it to be W-R-E-C-K-E-D'd. Because they've got it, it's in version 2.1, and it's really quite well refined and quite stable now. And there are implementations about it, and they're worried that it's going to change. I will have to say that the W3C appears to be very, very conscientious about this. The draft charter that you can see, I've given you the link at the end of my talk, the draft charter for this thing specifically cites ODRL and says we will build on the work of ODRL, and it specifically cites IPTC as a user and a contributor, et cetera. So the signs are pretty good that it will be done responsibly. This did happen with annotations, by the way. The Open Annotations Working Group built on the work of what was actually previously done by a community group on annotations and has largely respected that work and built on it. So IPTC has a standard called RightsML, and this is a profile of ODRL. It's designed for the news industry, but a lot of the kind of expressions in it are very much generally applicable to any kind of publication content, any kind of document that you want to associate rights with and send the rights with the document. So the reason I'm pointing this out is that's a place to look before our industry tries to reinvent something like that. It already exists, and it's already expressible as XML, as RDF, and as JSON. And they're making it open source. So this is a cool thing. It's right there ready for us to use, so let's not miss the opportunity to use that. The photo industry, this is kind of a related issue, is another really interesting example. I particularly bring this up because of this collaboration and convergence that I'm stressing so much. PLUS stands for Picture Licensing Universal System. It's actually quite an old initiative with a huge membership. Image creators, photographers, basically, lots of distributors, users, reproductive rights organizations, that's what RRO, that's what that acronym means. It's actually an initialism, not an acronym, but I won't get petty about that. They've got 154 countries involved in working together in this PLUS coalition, and they're collaborating with IPTC, which I mentioned. The LCC is the Link Content Coalition, ODRL, ISNI, which is the International Standard Name Identifier, IDER, which is that entertainment industry system that I mentioned earlier, ID Alliance is the magazine industry. All of these groups have kind of worked together to create this photo metadata and photo licensing standard. The metadata core of that is IPTC photo metadata, which they are now also extending to be video metadata. So again, there's lots of useful work that's well established there that a lot of people in our industry just are not even aware of, but it's there for the taking. What do all these things have in common? Well, it's the web platform, the open web platform. The web technologies and web services are where all this convergence is happening, and that's what enables all this interoperability. This is something that you've seen before, because I keep pointing out that what we generically think of as HTML5, there's really over 100 specs within the W3C. XML, HTML, CSS, SVG, MathML, those are all in this kind of umbrella open web platform construct. HTML5 is really the structural markup. It no longer has anything to do with presentation. It's only the structure. CSS3 is the styling. CSS is what Ahmed did all that magic with the equations with, and SVG, both open web platform standards. And JavaScript is the functionality. And just to remind you again that this is not just about your website. This kind of open web platform technology is fundamental to how content is developed and discovered and delivered in the world today. So I'm going to zip through some updates of some other technologies, because I have, I think, 15 minutes before I'm going to get a signal that I'm supposed to wrap up and allow questions. So this is something I've talked frequently about in this group as EPUB 3, but basically, as a reminder, it's basically packaged web content, and it's for the interchange and distribution of publications and documents, and it's completely based on web standards. And it's free, it's open, it's accessible, it's non-proprietary. We're now in the process of updating EPUB to be EPUB 3.1. First of all, don't panic, because we're very committed to it being backwards compatible with EPUB 3.0, which is the original one, and the 3.0.1, which is the current version of it. Some of the things that are being done in 3.1 are really just to clean up the spec, because it has now become a bunch of separate specs that have evolved in this kind of EPUB ecosystem over time, and really we need to integrate it into one spec again to make it more cogent and workable. We're also looking at deprecating some of the features that are in EPUB 3 that turn out nobody tends to be using them. Deprecating doesn't mean that you can't use them, but it means that someday we're probably going to take this out of the spec altogether. But for now, we tell you, please, we discourage you from using these things. And by the way, if anybody here is actually interested in the details on this, there's a survey that's out right now, and I believe the survey closes on December 15th, which is about a week, 2 weeks from now. So if you're interested in looking at what's being deprecated and giving your opinion about, wait, don't deprecate bindings, or don't deprecate the NCX. I don't think we actually have the NCX on that survey. But it's those kinds of things that are in discussion. Also, I don't know whether I want to mention this one, but I kind of have to, because it's a really big thing, is one of the things that's being considered. You realize that the content documents in EPUB are XHTML. It's HTML5, but expressed in XML syntax. And there is a big push on people on the technology side of things to just let it be HTML, not XHTML. I think you will know which way I will vote on that, but I may not prevail. I like XML. There's also discussion of the role attribute, which is currently kind of devoted to accessibility, particularly ARIA role accessibility expressions, and to put a lot of role attributes for things like, I will mention some words that you will say, you mean those aren't there already? Chapter. there's no such concept as a chapter in web markup. Footnote, no such thing as a footnote. So it's come out of that digital publishing interest group that I mentioned last year. We've come up with a list of wished for role attribute terms that the publishing industry needs that probably is going to happen. Potentially a new approach to metadata. I won't get into the detail on that. Possibly some new core media types. One of the things that's in active discussion is, should we have a media type for 3D? The current inclination is no, because there seems to be no consensus. And I keep saying, well, you know, I see a lot of rotating molecules. I see a lot of rotating galaxies in astrophysical literature. So the STM industry uses 3D. So if you guys have an opinion on that, speak up, because it'd be great to have a standard media type for that. And probably the most important thing is improved and much stricter support for accessibility. So the timeline on this is we're closing in on a first draft in January, and then that's for public discussion. It's a working draft. The final thing being put out to I can't remember this is when it gets put out for final balloting or whether that's concluded, but the final target is in October 2016 for 3.1. One of the concepts that's really interesting in this discussion is what's called a browser-friendly format for EPUB. And that is, it's not EPUB. No, that sounds stupid. But EPUB itself is really a pretty flexible, tolerant format. There are things you can do in EPUB that if you take that same content, it won't actually necessarily just work on the web. So the idea is we may be coming up with in effect, a specification within the EPUB 3 specification that if you want a browser-friendly format, in other words, this will just open in a browser, then you have to only do these things. You can't do these other things that are part of the EPUB spec. Whoops, sorry for that. So for example, anything that's been deprecated, you can still legally do in an EPUB, but it's not considered browser-friendly if you use a deprecated feature. Again, those surveys are out right now. It's also a metadata survey. That has a little longer timeline because that's just been released. So go to the idpf.org website if you're interested in participating in either of those. Last year, I talked about a new initiative that was called EPUB Plus Web, where the people in the web side, the W3C Digital Publishing Interest Group, are working to converge their specifications with the EPUB specifications, and the IDPF people are working to converge the EPUB specifications with the web specifications so that ultimately these things converge. Well, where that's gone in the last year is that we now have a specification called PWP, which is portable web publication. This is not in the IDPF side. This is the W3C. The latest working draft was just published last Friday. I'm giving you really up-to-date stuff here, guys. It was just published last Friday, and the link is on one of those last slides. It's a working draft, and the idea, the main concept is that this is all web content, but it actually, a given web publication, which, by the way, is a collection of files and documents. It's not just one web page. It includes style sheets, it includes fonts, it includes images, all that stuff. It can either be packaged for offline use or for archival use, or unpackaged for online use or to be cached. And that, as the web folks have that as a clear target to deal with the issues that they need to do, that's obviously bringing the web content much closer to what an EPUB is. And at the same time, we're working to bring the EPUB much closer to what just native web content is. So the idea is that, this is actually a quote from that working draft, is to reduce the current format and workflow level separation between offline and portable and online web document publishing to zero. So you no longer have to do something different for the web than you put in a package to deliver as an offline usable thing. It's just the same thing. Your workflows, it's just one workflow. So that's, I think, a really important issue. I won't get into more detail because I've got some more topics to cover here, but I just want to point out that identifiers are a huge issue because there really still isn't a good way to identify a publication in the abstract in the way that we have a journal article identified in the abstract of the DOI, and we have systems around that. But in the web world, a publication that's a whole collection of documents is a very complex issue to figure out how do we express an identifier. And I happen to be, my arm was twisted to I quote, volunteer as taking the leadership of that working group. And one of the big changes we made in the very first conversation about it last week was, we're not going to focus on identifiers, we're going to focus on locators. The little technicality, but people are often confused about a URN versus a URL. A URN, in effect, is a name of something. A URL is a location of something. They're both what are called URIs. I told you they were acronym mad. So what we've realized is mainly we need to be able to let publications have whatever identifiers they natively would have. And the issue with this online or offline publication is we need to have a stable way to point to where can you get it. So we're really going to focus on locator more than identifier and be as generic as possible on identifier, which is a good thing because we don't want publishers to have to say, well, this is my identifier. You mean I have to now use a different one? Here's an update on MathML. Everybody knows that this is a real sore spot in the web these days, and certainly for this constituency more than any other. I'm going to focus on MathJax, which is interesting in some cases parallel to what Ahmed showed, and in some cases taking a little bit different approach. But since MathJax is so widely used in this community, MathJax 2.6 has actually been in beta for many months. It's actually planned to go to final release within this month of December, since December 1st. Some of the things that first of all, you've got a link to where all the features of MathJax 2.6 are spelled out, but it really is a very significant update to MathJax. Very much improved accessibility, and especially for MathML-enabled assistive technology, because that's a huge issue to people in the accessibility community, is to make math accessible. And MathML is already accessible, but people don't use it enough. And it's all using presentational MathML, which is lacking a lot of semantics that's really needed. And the key to this MathJax 2.6 is it uses a new, what they're calling a common HTML format that performs much faster, it's much more stable across browsers, it's done in a more modular fashion, so it's really an important update. And then that's the basis for the work that's going to happen in 2016, improving the modularity further, implementing, basically, I won't say giving up, but I'm tempted to say giving up on, are the browsers ever going to implement MathML well? Well, we can't wait for that. So MathJax was originally created with the expectation that it was just a temporary solution because by now all the browsers would just be rendering math well, right? Well, they're not getting around to it, and they don't seem to be about to get around to it. So, so the white paper that's coming out this month, I believe I have a URL for that for you there. They're also have launched this semantic enrichment project. They've got some initial funding from the Sloan Foundation, and what that does is that it enriches presentational MathML, which is really the form that we all use, with semantic information that makes the ability to do responsive equations for mobile, and it makes the equations much more accessible to assistive technology so that and there's two demonstration projects. The link that I've got on my resources slide gives you a link to a demonstration version of each of these, the responsive equation and the accessibility solution, which is on the fly speaking the math equation in an intelligible way. And Peter Krautsberger, who's the guy I think of him as Mr. MathJax, and he really gave me all this information to update you with. I told him I would give a pitch for sponsorship for MathJax, because this constituency really needs this technology, and they need the financial support to be able to continue doing this work. So there's a little plug for MathJax. Speaking of accessibility, huge amount of work going on ultimately with the goal of making publications born accessible. I have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to have to really zip through this. But key thing that's driving a lot of urgency about this is, at least in the US, we have something called Section 508, which up till now has been accessibility requirements for K through 12 education, school education, and government documents. And it's allowed people to kind of, that don't do those two kinds of publishing, to say, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to worry about this right now, right? Well, the goal is really everything, all publications should be accessible. And so this new, what's called a refresh of Section 508, and this refresh only happens like once a decade, provides much broader, more generic, more generally useful, not publication-specific requirements for accessibility, more internationally, more aligned with international standards in accessibility. So that's going to happen within the next few months. That's going to become official. And at the same time, EPUB is moving to reinforce the perception that EPUB is the accessible format, which is what it is. The DAISY consortium recommends EPUB as the format in which to distribute accessible content. So there's a quick start guide to accessibility that the BISG published that gives you a really good overview of this topic. The reason I didn't send this presentation to Joe until last night is that that publication will be published probably later this week. And I asked BSG to just give me the URL that it will have so that I can put it in my slide for you. But that's going to be a really good resource for you. A couple other things just to make sure you're aware of these things going on. One is an initiative called SHARE. This comes out of kind of the higher ed and academic library space. Free, open, it's really a lot of metadata about ongoing research and the status of ongoing research. It involves universities, it involves libraries. From our space, Crossref, NISO, Chorus, Portico, ORCID are all involved in this initiative. It's really a its goal is a big repository of metadata about research, all the way from a data management plan in the first place to grant proposals, preprints, journal articles, data repository deposits, et cetera. And the first product of this initiative is something called Share Notify, and it went into public beta just this April. Also late-breaking news, this next slide is about creating an interoperable annotation ecosystem, and I was not allowed to put this slide up until 9 o'clock this morning because it was embargoed. This was announced today. It's an initiative really launched by Hypothesis, but they've pulled together a coalition of really a great set of scholarly publishers and others in our space, JSTOR, PLOS, HathiTrust, Crossref, Highwire, Wiley, 35 more players in our space, with the goal of establishing a common framework for the open interchange of annotation content. Really, really important for us. And they're thinking it's probably going to be maybe a 3-year project, building on that W3C Open Annotations Working Group work that I mentioned. So it's not, instead of that, it's using that to actually build the infrastructure and make it work in the real world. So I hope I'll be able to give you more updates on that in future years, that something is actually happening. It was just started officially today. And here's another one that you may have heard of, but it's really interesting if you haven't, which is making the web itself more responsive. And this is a Google initiative called Accelerated Mobile Pages, AMP. Even though it's being done by Google, it's all open source. It's all based on open web platform. And basically, its goal is to just make web content load way faster than it does today. And frankly, they're threatened by things like Facebook and Twitter and other vehicles for distributing stuff that frankly aren't the web, right? And there's this danger that a lot of content, as somebody earlier mentioned, that the New York Times is delivering lots of stuff on Facebook. So this is a response on the web side to make it respond as fast as those apps do. Right now, they're mainly working with news organizations, a whole bunch of them. I'm just giving you an example, as the New York Times is one of them. a lot of magazine publishers and a lot of CMS platforms. WordPress is a big player in this as well. And basically what it is it's a JavaScript-based implementation where a publisher takes their HTML and in effect they make AMP HTML out of it. And what this does is allows systems like your browser, et cetera, to, or Google or the platforms, again, this is not Google specific, to cache things that are going to recur so that when a user clicks on something on the web, and right now the rule of thumb is people don't want to wait more than 2 seconds or they get impatient or they give up on something. So the idea is this stuff just loads instantly that otherwise would take a long time to load. And the last one I'm going to mention is ISTC. I don't know if any of you remember, I probably have mentioned this in other talks in the past. This is the International Standard Text Code. This was the holy grail of a work identifier in the publishing industry, which never went anywhere. It was very frustrating, but there were flaws in the way that it was spec'd. It never got any take-up. And we actually have, I mean, I've always argued that the Crossref DOI is a work identifier. I usually get pushback and people argue with me, no, it's not. Yes, it is. It's not about a particular format of an article. It's any format. It's the article that DOI refers to, not whether it's a PDF or an online or an ebook or whatever. It's the article. Well, there is no general work identifier like that for books, for magazines, for those kinds of things. And the problem with the ISTC in the past was that as soon as you get 2 or more people in the room talking about what is a work, they disagree. They disagree about, well, is the Italian translation the same work or not? Is an abridgment the same work or not? Is a video of this thing the same work or not? So what is happening with ISTC is that they're working on a concept, and again, I say working on it, and you'll see in my list of resources I have URL to come for this one. It's because I was not allowed to actually give you the link to it because it's not public yet. This is an ISO standard. But I'm able to talk about the concept, and the idea is that it's clustering, so you're able to say, well, this level of ISTC is this work in its most general sense, and then this other ISTC that's a companion ISTC, this one, is all the ones in English, right? And this other cluster perhaps distinguishes between American English and British English, or between an abridgment. So anyway, it looks like a really fruitful avenue for pursuit. We'll see what happens with that. That's a don't hold your breath. This is just an interesting thing that's potentially coming back to life that was almost given up for dead. And like I said, at the end here, I've got 2 slides full of URLs for you if you're interested in pursuing these things. And thank you very much. I've got almost 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you.